Welcome to the podcast series Advancing Racial Justice in Education. This series was developed as part of the Lorentz Workshop Week on Institutional Racism in Dutch Basic Education. In this first episode, my guests and I will reflect on the ways in which race and racism can be understood and brought to light. So we are here today at the Lorentz Center. My name is Judy Mesman. I'm a professor at Leiden University and I work mostly on issues of education and parenting and institutional systems and inequalities in those systems and how maybe we can address those. And I have three guests today. I'm really happy that they wanted to be here with me to talk about this topic. And I'm looking to my left and will ask Alida to introduce herself.
I'm Alida Dors, Artistic Director of Theater Rotterdam, and I was invited today to talk about the power of storytelling and resilience in that. And I'm a theater maker, interdisciplinary theater maker.
And then we have Adrienne.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Judy, for inviting me. I'm Adrienne Dixson. I am a professor at Pennsylvania State University in Pennsylvania, and I am a scholar of critical race theory and education.
Cool. And then we have Daudi.
Hello, everyone. Judy, thank you for the invitation. I am Daudi van Veen. I'm an assistant professor at Erasmus University, specifically in youth and family studies, and my own work focuses on what youth learn about topics such as culture, ethnicity, and racism within their families and within the education system, and how that affects their well-being and their educational trajectories.
Yeah. Thank you. So, when in academia, often we talk about knowledge in the singular. But I think in many ways we're now realizing that there's no such thing as one singular piece of knowledge that, you know, tells us everything. The truth is not out there, is something I like to say. So we talk more about knowledges, right? Plural, different ways of knowing. So when it comes to knowing about what race and racism mean in our society, what different ways of knowing do we have? Maybe starting a little bit with scholars, the academic context. Maybe Adrienne, you can comment on how you navigate that issue in your work?
So I would mostly say I'm a qualitative researcher, so I like to hear firsthand people's experiences, perspectives, insights on how race manifests, not only in their personal experiences, but more broadly. So my work in New Orleans is kind of how people in New Orleans understand the changes in post-Katrina that most immediately have impacted school. So mostly I collect stories from people, and sometimes I use statistical methods, not always, but sometimes I do. So I say in our field, in education, we've been heavily psychologized. And so that has tended to be more quantitative research, and probably a turn kind of maybe in the late 80s, a turn towards more qualitative and thinking about how to make qualitative research more quote unquote rigorous. But in my particular area, and I would probably say most of my colleagues in critical race theory engage in the first person narratives about race and racial inequality in education. Yeah.
And I think, Daudi, you use a variety of methods. Can you highlight a few and how you create knowledge about these topics?
Indeed. So actually building off of what you just mentioned, so I predominantly work within the field of psychology in that sense, education/family studies, which is indeed quite quantitative. However, personally, I use a multi-method approach, you may label it as. So in the past, actually also often with UD, we've used, besides like traditional survey methods, with more, I guess you could say, critically oriented questions or skills that really go into the processes and beyond just simply looking at the categories, as was one of the topics that was discussed today. We've also tried to actively go into these, storytelling by looking at how families or parents end up communicating with children regarding, for example, certain topics that we're all interested in, such as culture, such as discrimination. And beyond that, I've also, in more recent times, actually used an existing other podcast that we ended up analyzing for to gain like qualitative insights from it, since it already, in in a way, podcast episodes can mimic structures of like traditional interview methods, and therefore traditional interview methods can also be used, or qualitative methods, to analyze those podcasts, to try to gain these deeper insights regarding racism and these processes within the educational system.
That's cool.
Yeah. So researchers use forms of storytelling, right, to get the stories, sometimes from interviews, sometimes with more community-oriented practices. When you make work in the theater, that's also a form of storytelling. And I know the issue of race and racism also play a role in your work. How do you view your knowledge-making practices as somebody who works in the theater rather than academia around this topic?
I think I would try to bring in topics and the story. I think I fuel it with everything I know and I see around me, or that I heard, and try to portray it in a sense that people can resonate to it and see what it says about their lives, or about their families' lives, or about people they know, and what would it do to them? How does it challenge them to activate them in a sense, to think about these topics and to really make them think, like, what can I do? How do I relate to that?
I like that you use the word think, because earlier we were talking a little bit about the thinking and feeling dichotomy that's often used, and how the arts are supposed to cater to your feelings. But you're also using think, I think, quite deliberately maybe. How do you see the idea of art producing knowledge and or feelings, both? How does that work in your practice?
Yeah, mainly I would like to say that theater space is a safe space to communicate and to bring stories to the table, to show stuff to people, topics to people in a space they can resonate firstly by themselves. They can really think again. Yeah, it's toch thinking. It's thinking. You want to act. I at least want to activate them. Like, what does it say about me and my position in this world? And that space is, in that sense, a safe space for you to reflect on by yourself to start with, and then take that information that you gained into the world, into your peers, into the conversations that you have.
And those knowledges come from you, or everybody who is performing on stage in your pieces?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. It's a collective story in a sense. I mainly, usually I bring a topic to the table, like I would like to address this in my next piece, and this is what I found, and what I found is books, is oral tradition that I came about, these stories. This is embodied knowledge. This is hearing it in a podcast or in radio. So you collect information about this certain thing you want to talk about, and then I always love to hear how people reflect on that and what they bring to the table, and then we add to the story, we fill it. So it's never really only about my perspective on things. I just filter it into a digestible story.
So what you just described sounds an awful lot like research, right? Because you're collecting data. You know, you wouldn't call it data, but maybe we would, right? And we try to put it in a format, analyze it, I suppose, so that we can then report on it. That's what we do. We don't stand on the stage, but we report. So how does that analogy work for the scholar?
Oh, yeah, I think
across from me?
Yeah, I think it's fairly accurate. What I try to do with the generation of the question is for it to come from the community, as opposed to my own thinking about what it could be. So more and more I've gotten into that. That wasn't initially even how I was trained as a researcher, but I think in the scholar activist tradition, really see myself as a resource and a tool. And I only came to that through my work in New Orleans. And I always say I was a reluctant activist because I wasn't trained to do that, but recognizing that people felt that they were invisible and voiceless because the mythology of Katrina and the remaking of schools is that it needed to be remade because it wasn't serving populations. And while some of that was true, the new New Orleans is not serving, and the change has been damaging and hurtful to the community and to people. And I mean, I've had mothers cry and children cry about how schools are so dissimilar. So the questions had to emanate from them and not from me coming in saying, this is the issue. And the more human side of it took precedence over my kind of scholarly inside knowledge that this is really what the field wants to know, because it's really irrelevant what the field wants to know. It's what can these stories tell the field and what they need to know, and then it drives then what our research agenda and what the field should look like, as opposed to imposing that onto the people. But it's taken, I want to be clear that I didn't come to that organically because of how I was trained as a researcher, but it became more common sense for me after being kind of in the space and recognizing what research has done to people and, in the name of quote unquote science and objectivity and et cetera.
And you're speaking of New Orleans and Katrina.
New Orleans, yeah.
Maybe for those who do not know, what is the racial aspect of that particular context?
Yeah, so in New Orleans, the schools were probably over 90% African American students. Teachers were about 80%, and of that 80%, about 70% were black women. And when Hurricane Katrina came, it devastated the city, as everyone knows. And in order to bring people back to the city, we needed schools, right? That was the driver. So how would people come back to the city? How would you get workers back? Where do workers keep their children? They need schools for their children. And New Orleans is driven by tourism, and low-wage workers keep that system afloat, if you will. And so who would work in restaurants and hotels and drive? At the time it was cabs, now it's Uber. We almost don't have any cabs left. But who would really support this system? And so schools were important in that. And then you had the managerial class that also needed to think about their children and where they would put their schools, and the political class and all that. So school education was a big driver in that. But the rhetoric about remaking the schools was that we had this historical racial inequity, and the way that we would address that was through education and remaking schools. And so it became a public charter system. In the U.S., charter schools are independently run schools, but they receive public funds. So they're not governed by an elected school board. Mm-hmm. They're run by individual private boards that are selected by the charter operators. And so it effectively became not a democratic system anymore. And that is throughout the whole system. So you don't have any schools that are run democratically by people in the city. And often you have multiple charter schools that are separate operators, but they have similar people on their boards. So there is, in some ways, a unifying ideology, even though the schools are supposed to be different. But what is clear is that the average parent has no say in their school and community member. So that was destabilizing for the community, for kids, for community members who were very invested in public education, for families, and for businesses it worked really well, for politicians it worked really well, for the managerial class it worked really well, but for the rank and file it didn't.
And with your research you try to bring the knowledge of those African American communities to the fore, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because that was not really a story that was heard in this entire post-Katrina story. Yeah. So Daudi, in what way do you feel like your research contributes to bringing out knowledges that are otherwise unheard when it comes to the issue of race?
What I've been reflecting on, as it was mentioned earlier, is this idea of giving voice. So if I think back roughly, so I'm going to maybe expose my age, but if I think back to my undergraduate years and think about what I thought research was back then, my view of research was, these are these snazzy new findings regarding this, regarding that, these quick facts that you might remember or not remember that catch headlines. And as I developed as a scholar, more and more, I really do see my work as giving voice to things that might already be known in particular communities due to particular experiences, but are not seen as legitimate by broader society, by policy workers, etc., because it hasn't been molded or put into the mold of a academic paper or report. So I do see the way I approach my research very much as giving voice, that I do think that at times what I'm sharing is more so affirming what people already know regarding their own experiences and regarding particular traditions or what they have gone through themselves, but helping to mold that into a way that is, I guess, acceptable to the broader academic apparatus or how we value knowledge within society.
Do you reckon that giving voice is, I think, also something that a piece in the theater can do? Do you feel like that is valued knowledge in society? Because academic knowledge has standing and has, right? On the other hand, it's also sometimes misses the mark because it doesn't always manage to be described in a way that people understand or can relate to. How do you...
Yeah, it's maybe similar in a way that the way the story is being presented in the artistic world also says a lot about if people value it as artistically enough. So is what is being said even heard because of the form it's being presented in, the dramaturgy of the story. Whilst sometimes the story needs a different dramaturgy than the Western canon.
Sure.
And that is a strange tension between telling stories to affirm or to address new topics or to give insights, whereas the people you want to receive that knowledge don't necessarily can look further than the shape and the form it's being presented in to really listen to what is being said.
So they evaluate it, I think, by traditional quality indicators and don't recognize it as art because of...
worthy to be listened to or to be even seen.
To be valid.
And in the other hand, the stories that are being told are really being appreciated by the people that recognize their stories within it. So that's a strange dichotomy. It's it's a battle, like finding the space, finding the right audience to share it with, but also finding other audience who need to hear this for their own development, maybe for societal reasons.
I recognize how sometimes you need somebody with academic titles to put it out there because then it's taken seriously. I've also found that very frustrating when I'm like, these people have been saying this for God knows how long, and now you listen because there's somebody with academic titles telling you. But I think if that's the conduit that we can be, then maybe that's... and I think a theater maker can be a similar conduit once they have a certain, standing in the artistic field. So... we were talking earlier, and you mentioned it briefly, about the stuff that communities of color know, have experienced, and sort of know holds true for their lives. And there is no academic paper that proves it. And I'm putting my fingers in the air to do quotation marks. When it comes to knowledges about race and racism, what do we need? How do we feel like we navigate being heard and taken seriously, right? Because even with academic titles, if you do very qualitative work, or it's easy to say, oh, this is academic work with a political agenda, so it's not neutral, it's not objective, it doesn't have a big enough sample. Do you have strategies on how to deal with that?
I don't know. It's so I and this may sound naive, I don't know, but I'm a full professor like you, Dell professor, so I don't really have to care about it. But I never cared about it before anyway, because I think it's who are you speaking to? And so I decided very early on that I wasn't writing for white people. I was writing for someone like me. My dissertation research was on Black women teachers and their pedagogical philosophies and practices, and I could find very little literature on that. And to my harkening back to my music training, one of my music professors, his name was Alvin Baptiste, clarinetist in New Orleans, and he would say, we have to document. And for musicians, documenting is recording. So he recorded a lot because we need to leave the documentation that we were here, that we created music, that he was really big into Louisiana, that there is a Louisiana music, a Black Louisiana music, and we need to document that. And so I think about the notion of documentation and who I'm leaving this for, and not to prove to white people anything, but to leave it for someone like me, someone who will be looking for the story, looking for that Black people were here, that they resisted, that they organized, that they had feelings about things, that they had a critique of the system, that they are, intellectually capable. That's almost, heretical, right? In our field, is that we don't believe that, Black children believe and think things and can do. And so it's really the documentation of the experience. And so for me, being an academic is a different form of I was a composition major, music theory and composition major. So it's a different way of composing and documenting an experience that's not musical, but it is the written word. And I don't think of myself as a creative writer, but I think in this particular area, as I'm in the academy, I recognize the importance of leaving a record, because if you don't, you won't know. You won't know that Black people resisted Katrina, right? You wouldn't know that. If you watched NBC in the U.S., if you watched the U.S. press, you would think everybody was happy with it. And so for me, that's enough. And again, I take this in some part from my doctoral advisor was Gloria Latson-Billings. And one of the first things she told me is that I'm not doing research to convince white people of anything.
So I've had conversations with academics of color about this. And on the one hand, there is this drive to prove to everybody what we all know to be true, because we want things to change, and people in power tend to be white, and to convince them, look, it is really racism. And certain studies are really convincing, like the CV studies with the identical CVs and different names or pictures. People find that rather compelling because it's so clear, exactly the same CV, and still they're not, because we all think we make such rational choices. But indeed, what you're saying, a lot of academics are saying too, why do I have to keep on proving this over and over again? And yet sometimes I and others feel like we have to, because there's still swaths of people who do not believe it, who should, given the positions that they're in. So do you ever talk to white audiences about your studies?
I am, because I'm in the academy.
Right.
But I don't look for those spaces, honestly. I don't seek them out, because I think it's much more, and because of feedback that I've gotten too from young scholars, from teachers who I've studied, and they've seen themselves, and it was affirming, right? It was a recognition that this is a part of a broader story. I have a piece, but it's a part of a broader story, or, that's her story and that's also my story. So I don't seek out spaces to talk to white people, because I just don't feel like I need to convince them, because I don't want to. As a critical race theorist, honestly, I don't believe that we will ever, that's the racial realism piece, right? That I call it the okie doke. The okie doke is always going to come. We will figure it out. And Derek Bell talks about the way that racism will shift and change to meet the moment, and it always does. And so it can't be convincing the systems that continue to subordinate. People are part of those systems, but the system just reinvents itself. So I want for people who are subordinated to not internalize that as this is something that you did and you're less than. and that it is possible to still fight, because that's a part. So people have critiqued critical race theory as being pessimistic, but it's recognizing that this is the context, and the hopeful piece is that we keep fighting, right? So I do classroom level research, and I was really depressed about what was going on in New Orleans. And I woke up one day, I was like, oh my God, how can I keep doing this work? Because we just keep taking L's, like they just winning. And a parent called me and she said, Dr. Dixson, I need you to come down here. The kids walked out of school. And I was like, Viva la Revolucion. I was like, that's what I needed. And the kids walked out, and true New Orleans kids, it was hot. They brought chairs because they weren't going to stand. So they brought chairs out the building, but they refused to stay in the school because
Amazing.
They didn't have running water. I mean, it was a crying shame, the conditions under which these kids lived, and they walked out.
Cool.
And
Amazing.
that's it.
Daudi, in terms of the audiences, who do you do it for? Do you engage with all audiences or only some audience? What is your strategy or conviction there?
So I guess it depends on the audience that I'm communicating with and how I try to communicate about it. So for example, earlier we mentioned this like giving voice aspect, and I feel like if I'm talking to other people of color, it's mostly affirming their experiences, and it seems to be just a way to further legitimize what they already know. However, in my teaching role currently, I do feel this responsibility that these students, more likely than not, will not often be exposed to certain views, certain knowledges, except for within this 8-week time period.
And your students are mostly white, just to clarify, no?
My students used to be mostly white, but my
The word got out.
They know where to find you.
They know where to find you.
My students at Utrecht University were mostly white. My students now at Erasmus University it's probably about half or so have a ethnic minoritized background and half are white. So it's roughly, I would say, 50-50. However, most will go on to work within the city of Rotterdam, which if you're looking at the youth population is majority ethnic minoritized. That sounds very odd, but I think everyone understands what I meant by that. So what I do feel now, at least in my, also when I mostly had white students, but especially now working in Rotterdam, I feel like an extra responsibility in that I want these students to leave to have the knowledge of what racism actually does, the consequences of it for the well-being of youth, how it actually affects them. I know that if we're talking about smoking, other health behaviors or risk behaviors that might affect health, that is convincing, let's say, for a program of students such as mine, which are studying child and family studies, or in Dutch you would say pedagogiek. So knowing that, I do try to mimic my language to make sure that they understand, like, there are mental health consequences. There are particular health consequences. There are particular educational consequences. Also considering that roughly speaking, aligns with the fields that they'll enter. They'll enter the fields of education. They'll enter other like youth-focused fields. So I do adjust my language for that with this idea of like, if I only have you within this short time period, what can I teach you in order to give you enough tools that you can think back to years from now when you are faced with a ethnic minoritized family or a young person who's going through something? Will you, roughly speaking, have the skills to think back to what you learned to help them in those moments? So I would say like my motivation, at least for how I communicate to my students, was very much with this idea of like, when you go out into this world, you need these tools to help the people who I care about.
I'm probably 90% of my speaking engagements are for white people. So that includes my classroom at Leiden University, but also all the organizations I go to speak about my Leadership in Color project. And it's interesting to find out the right tone. Who do you try and teach what and how? And sometimes I'm in front of a whole group of people of color, and it's a completely different conversation. And my wording is different, and so I do recognize that. So if I go to the theater, and I go to the theater a lot, and I go to see Alida's pieces, and then even when some of the pieces are explicitly about topics of Black oppression or of Black life experiences or more general issues of inequalities in society, it doesn't seem to matter, but the room is predominantly white, right? An old grey and white is usually the case, and I think when your group performs or your pieces are performed, there's more color in the audience for sure, but it is still such a white space. How does that influence how you portray stories and knowledges about race and racism to a predominantly white audience?
Yeah. Well, I stopped explaining myself too much. I think I want to address the topic, and I hope sometimes it aggravates or it tickles something in somebody to do their homework, to go back like, oh, what exactly did they mean? Or so you throw some seeds out, but I don't feel like explaining too much anymore. At least I have the luxury maybe now to find different of a variety of expressions that makes that I don't want to explain too much in my pieces. I want to address it and add value to it in a different way. But maybe when I have to do a keynote somewhere where I know that the audience is predominantly white, then I might dive into it deeper or take it from a different perspective. And yes, of course, then the language will change. But as we talked earlier also, I think we have different types of activists, and I feel myself shifting from this moment 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I felt the energy and the urge to convince certain people in certain spaces, and finding myself repeating that too much, I felt like, no, I cannot do this anymore with the right care to it. Oh yeah, you get frustrated, you get excited too much, you get emotional, and this is not maybe the right context to be that in, or to misuse your pain, your frustration. So I hope, and that's also what I see, we have different types of activists, soldiers, addressing different spaces and in different ways. And this is what I hope to believe, I want to believe. So I shift now to another position. I'm getting older, I'm getting riper, and I'm embodying that. So I'm not doing the field work anymore.
I think you also took an activist advocacy storytelling role around this topic when you were a guest at Zomergasten.
Yes.
For the non-Dutch listeners, this is a program that is aired in summer. It literally translates as summer guests. It does. And it's 3 hours?
Yes.
It's a 3-hour conversation with one person who gets to show what they find important in life, and in little clips from television shows or movies or and you did one, and you really did, I think, teach and preach in a good way. Was that did you make a conscious decision to do that?
Yes, I think I took that stage.
Yeah, exactly.
Deliberately.
That's
I didn't want to only address Black joy. I wanted to address Black pride, but to address Black pride and confidence, I wanted to bring with me where I came from and what is my background, and what is the resources that I tapped out of to grow and to grow within this society in a way. What gave me power, what gave me strength, what gave me representation, what did I need to see to be part of this movement, because they only saw me on Zomergasten, but I hope that I shared with them, you only see one, but we come with many. It's a time, it's a movement. Who said that? It's not Maya Angelou.
No.
It was Audre Lorde, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's. I wanted to bring in an awareness, a moment, and a movement of where we are as Black people. That is a very difficult statement that I'm making now, but
I think it was Angela Cooper, actually. When and where I enter, whenever I enter, the whole world enters with me.
So
Yeah.
Beautiful.
It's recognizable when I presented the report, Leadership in Color, with 40 interviews with 40 people of color in leadership positions. And I do this presentation about it, and people are like interested, and there's lots of quotes from them, and they're like, oh, wow, these people in leadership positions, and this is still some of their experiences. And then after a while, people started emailing me. I was bombarded with emails of people of color saying, you wrote my life down in that report. I thought I was crazy. I'm not crazy, because there's apparently 40 other people who have the same, at least part of the 40 people. Not everybody had the same experience, also important to note. And then I started including a slide with quotes from those emails from just random people who said, this is so recognizable. This is exactly what happens to me. And that slide, for some reason, always does it. And
That legitimizes it.
I guess, right? But 40 people interviewed, but I always notice in a room, it's the slide with everybody saying, this is not 40 people, this is hundreds of people, this is all of us, this is so... And that's interesting. So I think that relates to what you were saying, Alida, about you told your story, but it stands for so much more. Yeah. So we have this. Earlier today we sat in a cipher with Alida, talking about what drives us, I suppose. What gets out of bed in the morning? What are our values in the work that we do, in the practices? And can you recall maybe a time when that really, when you were harvesting that, right? When even if it's one encounter or something got picked up or a student learned something where you were like, oh, this is why I do it, because I have now managed with the knowledge I create or put out there. Do you have an example, Adrienne, of when you felt very gratified of?
I think there are those blips, and probably because I'm a professor, it is with students. So early in my career, I described myself as a fugitive from teacher education. I found torturous to be in teacher ed, and so I happily left. But I taught a course on the foundations of education. And my interpretation of the foundations was you have to understand the context of the U.S. and the history of racism in the U.S. and whiteness, and how can you go into teaching if you don't really understand these issues. And there was something I called the week 4 effect. So the first 4 weeks or the first 3 weeks, students, mostly white students, would be, oh, I've never read anything. This is really interesting. And then by week 4, they've looked at the rest of the syllabus and see that we're not letting up, right? We're not getting to the happy part.
There's no relief.
We're going to keep doing this. And faced incredible resistance. And I mean, they didn't like me. It was clear they didn't like me. I didn't quite like them either. But what was gratifying is that maybe a year later, 2 years later, students would write me and would thank me and apologize and ask for resources. I knew they were throwing books away, but they would say, can you send me, what's the book that we read on this and this article on this, and I learned so much. And I knew it was coming, and I would tell them, you might be angry now, but when you get in that classroom, the voice of Dr. Dixon will whisper in your ear. And you will not be able to do some things because you will have thought about what you learned. I didn't have the evidence of it, but I have the evidence. And so to your point, I've used some of those quotes from students in my slides when I talk about teaching about race and how one engages young people in thinking about their role in the perpetuation of racial inequality, and what you can do to disrupt it is to be thoughtful. There's no magic answer. It's just being thoughtful, and what is your role in that, and that they come back. They all come back. Cool. It takes, and I tell you have to be patient. It's not going to be next semester, and maybe several years later, but they do come back, and that's what keeps me going.
I always say the anti-racism work doesn't get you roses, but
maybe
2 years later you get some roses after all. What about you, Daudi?
So your story made me think about this this festival. I believe it was about 2 years ago. Yeah, it should be 2024, summer of 2024. I did a speaking engagement at a festival where I was talking to parents and children about bullying. However, my pitch to them was like, I will gladly talk about bullying if I can specifically also talk about racism amongst children. And that was my way of trying to like introduce them also to this topic for them to understand like the complexity of what some parents might simply label as bullying, but like actually what how it's experienced by a lot of young children of color. And I remember during that event, it was a predominantly white audience, and I remember seeing some of the glaring eyes from parents as I was speaking, and seeing some of the nods from parents of color. So some of the white parents, glaring eyes, some of the parents of color were heavily nodding. And I was like, okay, I chose the right stage to talk about this. I think this was about a 15-minute like Q&A almost was the setup. And at the very end of the Q&A, it was mostly children of color who walked up to say like thank you and just like have a little high five moment, which was a nice moment for me personally, because I remember being a young boy of color growing up here in the Netherlands and not having these moments of seeing these like role models that I would have loved to have seen. And a young boy came up to me, was probably about 11 or 12 years old, a young boy of color, and he just started sharing his experiences. Like he just started saying, hey, what you mentioned, I have experienced this, I've experienced that. His mom ended up joining him as well. And I spoke to them for probably about 15 minutes or so, trying to give them advice, trying to understand like, well, what is he learning about like his own heritage or not? And afterwards, it made me, it was such an affirmation of like a conversation I would have loved to have had when I myself was younger, and a strong affirmation of like why I do what I do. And while that was like a glaring moment with this one child who came up to pour out their hearts and pour out his heart and share his experiences, it really did affirm like, okay, this is what I'm doing all this work for, all these late nights, all the bad work-life balance aspect that many academics recognize, and others who care about these topics. But it was an affirmative moment for me. Yeah.
Nice. That's nice.
Yeah.
You must have had some as well as Alida.
I think it's about the same. It's getting that affirmation from somebody and that recognizes their story in yours, or it helps them to be more brave in their own path in a way or something. That's what's giving. That's what makes it worth the effort and gives me also the confidence to dig deeper for myself and to find ways of expressing myself even sharper without the intention of excluding, but very much being aware that that's a result of things, can be a result of things. And in my profession, maybe as theater director, I also now think of that effect. Like, okay, if people are being excluded or feeling excluded and it's harmful to them and they want to vent that in a way, we now try to address that or make it possible to do that in a setting where people can share that experience, or we at least capture it. We embrace that disturbing feeling or something. But I will try not to take it away out of the work itself, but maybe the aftercare that's being more important in certain settings. But that people recognize your voice, that is so empowering.
How does this, maybe a little final round of linking this to education more of children? There's two academics who work with, higher education, and they're young students, but maybe children is going a bit far. And we've been talking about more basic education, so really elementary school, secondary school. So how does a lot of this talking about the stories, the knowledges, the giving voice, bring to the fore, relate to what primary and secondary education could do when it comes to knowledge and insight and progression in terms of race and racism in society? What would you say, Adrienne?
Well, I mean, I would have, and I have. There's a wonderful book that Sonia Cisneros wrote, The House on Mango Street.
I haven't read it, but I saw it.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah. And so I've used that with teachers to have them think about, she's a poet. So there are poems about her life as a little girl, and you almost forget that an adult wrote the book. And she has a poem called 11, and she writes about being 11 that's really beautiful. It's intertwined with kind of being 11 and feeling like a little kid at 11, but also she adds on race and poverty and gender, and it's just really rich. She writes a story about her name. One of the girls in the book is called Esperanza, and how going to school, the teachers and the white students couldn't say Esperanza, and so she was like, the beautifulness of hearing it from her family sounded like they had at school. It sounded like someone had nails in their mouth. So it's a really rich story, but I use it to talk about race and have teachers do their own autobiographies around race. So we read those stories, and then they write their own stories about their name. And I can't tell you how many teachers start to cry, white teachers, when they have to write the story about their name, because it reminds them about their aunt who they were named after or whatever. And so I have them think about, well, what does this, if you feel this way, thinking about your name, what about young people when they have to think about who they are and the attachment they have to being 12, or the confusion around being 16, or their name being Tamika, or, Chandrika, or something that doesn't seem, normal in the kind of mainstream sense. And so how do we help young people write these narratives about themselves that can feel empowering and feel affirming and recognize where they are at those moments? So I encourage teachers to do that. With my own students, we did a check-in. When I taught 6th grade, we would do a check-in every Monday. And it was long. It took forever. I didn't give them a time. But it was, tell me what you did until you got to school. So I want to know, like, what led you? What are the things that you did before you came here today? And we learned a lot about each other. But it was creating a space for them to be seen and be heard.
Beautiful.
Nice, very nice around the names and the,
What was the title again of the book?
The House on Mango Street.
We're going to remember that one.
Yeah, definitely.
What about you, Daudi? How could we apply some of these things to?
So I think that we underestimate at times like how complex children's ideas can be regarding these topics. And what it reminds me of is when thinking about how could we approach teaching children about racism in elementary school, in early high school, there's a few interventions that are running. There's like this Developing Inclusive Youth intervention in the U.S. run by Professor Melanie Killen and her team. There's the Identity Project from Adriana Umanya Taylor, which in the Netherlands is being run by Mehmet Day. And these are all focused on quite young children, well, young children in the sense of the later elementary school, early high school, so 10, 11, 12, 13, so quite young. And in these interventions, they have the styles of the interventions are different, but at their core, they're learning about identity, they're learning about heritage, they're learning about racism and what it means, what it looks like, and they're made to reflect on it with each other and go into conversation with their fellow peers, but as also with the teachers who are involved in these programs. And these interventions seem to be quite effective on a broad range of, for example, having children think about their own identities more, being more inclusive to one another. So these are all quite young children, and there seems to be this building evidence that they are more than ready to have these conversations, to learn about these things, and then they also actively benefit from learning about these things. So I guess that's what we need to recognize, that a lot of children are ready to have these conversations, might already be having these conversations with fellow peers, and that as adults we can help structure these conversations and like provide our, I guess, adult knowledge, quote unquote, that they might already be kind of privy to, but really help structure it more so.
Yeah, that's a good point. We talked to students, high school students, the other day here within this workshop week, and they were basically saying that, they experienced racism, these were students of color, and they talk about it with their peers, and it's not talked about in school, and they wish that it was. They are ready, they want to talk about it. Alida, education and storytelling around race, have you engaged in any of that from a theater background or other experiences?
I think yes. I have made a performance about blackness, and performed it especially for schools.
Yeah.
Together with another choreographer, but it remained difficult because when you tour and you see that in the bigger cities that it resonates much easier. The audience can really sit still and focus, and then you have these after talks and you come to some insights. But we have been to places where, they just didn't want to be there. They didn't want to see it. They were uproaring. So sometimes it misses the purpose of the thing or that you want to reach. But I think it's still important to try to show it and then to voice it. Mm. It's here. It's happening. It's us, this society. So it feels like it's important to address it in different ways. And if art is not the way, then we go about it in a different way. Yeah, we need to practice to talk about this. I think the sooner the better. Mm-hmm. The sooner the better.
So practice and different methods, different entry points, I suppose, for different audiences at different places and at different times. But that it is possible and necessary, I think, is quite clear from most of our experiences here. Yeah. We're going to round off. I'm very happy with what you brought to the table. It was very insightful. So thank you very, very much for being part of this podcast. And we'll close it here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you too.